Nothing prepares a parent for waiting to find out whether a child will live or die. Finally, Jeremy is wheeled into a darkened cubicle in the intensive care unit, and I describe what he looks like. At first, it is almost too much to look at him. We reach out to touch him without disturbing the medical equipment. Our son is still with us. When I first started working in my MFA program on trying to take my 500 pages of notes and make a book out of it, one of the first teachers I worked with looked at it and said, "Where are you in this story?" And I didn't know what she was talking about. Self-disclosure isn't and wasn't easy for me at all, and I just had this horror of putting in too much of my own feelings and emotions. I didn't realize that that's really what memoir is about. The narrator, the I, the upright pronoun, is a key element of any memoir. The writer and the narrator are not the same person. I mean, they are the same person, but they must be separate in the process of writing. The writer is in control of the story. The writer has to understand what the story is about in a way that the narrator, the person who was there at the time, may not have understood it at all. And my narrator was initially missing. When I finally rewrote that passage about seeing Jeremy outside the surgery the first evening, again, I describe what he looked like. It's a long description, and it was pretty gruesome. And then I wrote, "To see my child like this, flesh of my flesh, the tender body that I had cared for, so violently desecrated. For a moment I recoiled, a coward. I couldn't bear to look at him. Shuddering, I seized hold of myself. This is no time for fear. I couldn't leave whatever part of Jeremy was alive in this mutilated body, alone. I took a shaky step toward his bed, and then another and another, until I was standing close, looking down at him. Hearing, vision, speech were gone, but touch remained. I cautiously reached through the tubes and wires to stroke his cheek with the backs of my fingers and cup my palm under his chin. He was warm. Under my hand, his heart still beat. My son still lived. It was a long journey for me to get to the point of being able to put that much of myself into the story. And it wasn't until much time had passed and the events were no longer so raw and painful for me that I was able to do that. But even so, it was very hard and wrenching, and I had to pull those memories out of myself and put them down on the page. But that is critical for the memoirist, because that is why the reader reads memoir, I believe. The reader wants to see the mind of the writer at work. The great essayist Michel de Montaigne wrote in an essay, and the memoir is a form of a literary essay, it's an outgrowth of that. Montaigne wrote, "In an essay, the track of a person's thoughts struggling to achieve some understanding of the problem is the plot, is the adventure." So memoir is not simply a story. The writer must tell the story, but at the same time reflect on it, try to unravel the meaning in it, either implicitly or explicitly. It's a striving for truth, for some truth, some effort to place your experience in a broader context that will make it universal and appealing to the reader. One of the things that you probably didn't notice about the little passage that I just read in the first draft and then in the final draft is that I wrote my first draft in the present tense. Everything was written exactly as it happened at the time. Not surprisingly, I was writing it at the time. When I had my whole book, my manuscript for my thesis finished, I sat down with my thesis advisor and she said, "It doesn't work in the present tense." And I rewrote the entire book in a mad scramble. You can't imagine I mean, you can't just go through changing all the verbs from present to past. I changed the whole thing to past tense. And that is because it was only by writing in the past tense that I was able to create the space to reflect. Because most of the time, if you're writing in the present tense, you are not standing back from the experience and saying, oh, I think this is what it means. You're just experiencing it. If you write in the past tense, you as the writer, as opposed to the narrator, can stand back from the experience and reflect on it. One of the themes that finally emerged for me as perhaps the most important theme in the book, and again, one that I didn't realize was a theme, was the theme of faith and the role of faith in my life as I experienced it at this time, and also in Jeremy's recovery. I am an educated, logical, rational person trained in the Western mode of thinking, and I'm not somebody who easily uses the word miracle. But my belief is that we did witness not one but several miracles in Jeremy's progress toward recovery. Eventually, he'd been in the hospital a month longer. He was out of the coma. He was not present consciously in any sense. He couldn't speak. He was still completely paralyzed. And my father-in-law, who is an Episcopal priest, suggested that we ask the people who were part of our email network to organize a prayer vigil for Jeremy. It was very simple. We asked everyone on a particular Sunday evening to light a candle, to reflect on Jeremy, to pray if they felt moved to pray, to keep the candle lit for an hour, and to pray and think on Jeremy whenever their eyes came to rest on the flame. I had very mixed feelings about asking people to do this, although I did eventually agree to go ahead and ask people to pray. This is, again, a part of the reflection that I was able to introduce because I wrote in the past tense, and I had the time to understand what this meant to me, and in a way that I didn't when it first happened. I was deeply reluctant to ask friends and strangers to pray for Jeremy. Although I had a lifelong practice of private prayer, there was something unseemly about making it a public participatory event. It felt like a revival show. What would people think? Especially our irreligious Berkeley neighbors and the super rational lawyers with whom I worked. I couldn't imagine their reactions. That poor family. They've really gone off the deep end. I guess people will believe in any kind of hocus pocus if they're desperate enough. And it seemed presumptuous to ask hundreds of people to pray for just our child. Why should they? Everyone had his or her own troubles to bear. If nothing resulted, as was likely, what would I say to all these people? I would be seen as naive at best, gullible, a fool at worst. And even more, I was afraid to test my faith. What if nothing happens? How can I bear even one more disappointment? I've lost so much already. Of course, faith doesn't follow Newton's law. For every action, there isn't a proportional reaction. You don't put your money in God's vending machine and pull out a candy bar every time. Faith means ceding control, or more accurately, realizing that control didn't exist in the first place, and that you have always been at the mercy of a power larger than yourself. Yet despite the hard lessons of the past weeks, it was still difficult to admit my fundamental powerlessness to give myself and Jeremy over to God. Well, that spiritual journey was for me a critical part of the story. And it took me a long time to realize it and a long time to write about it. It's not easy to write about faith, especially in the present day, in our present culture. I'm actually European by birth. My parents immigrated when I was fairly young, 4 years old. I learned English, my second language, when I started first grade. Both of my parents are from Central European countries where Catholicism has been rooted for over a millennium, and I was raised Catholic. I have been fortunate in that I have always felt God's presence in my life. There's never been a time when God wasn't real and imminent to me. But as happens with many people, I fell away from the church as a young adult through college. We returned to worship when our children were young because we wanted to raise them with a religious upbringing, but we worshiped in my husband's faith, which was the Episcopal Church. These events that I describe in the book actually brought me back to Catholicism. I'm a revert to the Catholic Church. I find that the most comfortable place for me. And I don't actually talk about that in the book explicitly, but the faith journey, which is touched on in the book, was really, an answer to your question earlier, Lynette. What are things that we gain out of experiences that are very hard? That was definitely something that I gained. I don't want to give away too much of what happens in the book, but 24 hours, I want to read a short excerpt, very short, of what happened. Within 24 hours after this prayer vigil, I was at home. It was my husband's night in the hospital. I had been there the night before. I was at home tonight. This is actually an email that I sent out at the time, and I should have mentioned that the book incorporates many of the contemporaneous emails along with their narrative text. And that's one thing about the memoir. It's an amazingly flexible form. It can take the form of first-person narration. It can be humorous, lighthearted, spiritual. It can incorporate letters. It can incorporate emails. It's tremendously adaptable. And so for my form, I chose to incorporate some of the email because I gave it an immediacy, and then the past tense narrative, which is more reflective. But back to the email, which I sent out at 3:32 a.m. I was at home tonight, Monday evening, 24 hours after the prayer vigil for Jeremy's healing circled the globe. When the bedside phone rang sometime after 11 p.m., I threw myself across the bed and grabbed for the receiver, my heart racing, preparing myself for yet another emergency. Hi, Mom. This is Jeremy. I am sorry to wake you up. I love you. A voice I hadn't heard for a month and had begun to believe I might not hear again in this world. I laughed and sobbed into the telephone. My God, Jeremy, is that you? You spoke. Oh my God, it's a miracle. Oh, thank you, God, thank you. My heart flies on the wings of the morning. Later, reflecting on this event, I wrote, was it a miracle? I can't say. I'm a lawyer, trained to assess evidence and arrive at answers, but analysis supplies no answer to this question. I can tell you that these events happened exactly as I've described them here. Jeremy found his voice again after long silence, and shortly after an intense prayer event. Was it coincidence? Improbable, but possible. Extraordinary, unexpected, rare. All those things, yes. A miracle? Maybe. I don't claim to know God's mind, and if I did, I do not think others would take my word for his intentions. Those who doubt will find reasons to doubt. Those who believe will find reasons for belief. It is enough for me to say that it was a great and glorious gift, and thank you. I have a few suggestions for the process of writing itself. One is the decision about how to frame your story in time, space, and cast of characters. When we're writing memoir, we often start off too big.